Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and with me today is Janell Blue. Janell is the president of our sponsor, the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society. And today we're going to talk about one of the most important resources for genealogists, because the information in it can help guide us to other records and resources to go look for, and that's the federal censuses. So why is the census so useful to a researcher?
Well, it's my go-to resource anytime that I'm beginning to do some research, because it has a wealth of information. Now that depends on the decade that I'm looking at, of course, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But actually, the federal census got started in 1790, and so up until even we just filled one out this year. So every 10 years we have that, and the beginning, the initial one was only 6 questions, and they focused on households. So for 6 decades, for 6 census years, there was no individual information except for the head of the household. Oh. And so later on we're going to show you a sample of what that looks like, but they're mostly just stick marks, which is not that helpful for a genealogist, and yet there's something for that head of household and the numbers of people in it that might be helpful if you know in advance what you're looking for. It can corroborate.
And that's one of the things, and I haven't seen this at conferences in recent years, but when I first started going to conferences 20 plus years ago, there were several lecturers that lectured on using those censuses and what they were able to do with those statistics and other information to identify the household. And they've gotten away from that. It's something they need to bring back.
Yeah, I mean, I know people can really tease a lot out of that, but you sort of have to start with something, because otherwise it's just not going to have the names. Anyway, so after that, though, then in 1850, we start seeing an enormous amount of information, and it kind of morphs. It keeps adding stuff depending on what the country is interested in at the time, and what the Congress is interested in.
Yes, and of course you said they started with 6 questions. I don't remember. There weren't very many questions when I filled out the census form. I looked at it and I thought, 72 years from now, this is really not going to be that helpful for future generations of genealogists who want to know about me.
In working with the census and in working with looking at the different years and the different kinds of questions that we asked, I got really curious about sort of what the origin of it was, what was the original purpose, and why sometimes they would have a question and then other times they didn't. So you can go onto the National Archives website and kind of get this history. You can also, there's some other books out there that you can find, but there's been a lot written about the history of it. And you know what? It's in the Constitution.
Yes.
And it was set up in the Constitution because of apportionment. The framers had established this House of Representatives, and then they gave the census as the way that they would decide what amount of representation each state would have, and it would be based on population. That also, by the way, the Electoral College is also determined that way. And then the other function was for states, for taxes, and how much that each state was going to be assessed in their taxes. Because in the early years, that's how the country, they would assess tariffs and things.
We didn't have an income tax back then.
No, we didn't, and that came later. So at that point, they needed money from the states, but this was a way for them to do it. And even this is clever, because they decided that there was a check and balance with, say, for instance, if the state over-reported their population, then they would have to pay more taxes. And if they understated their taxes or their population, they would be underrepresented. I mean, they might not have to pay as much taxes, but they'd also lose that representation. So that was pretty clever. Also, in the Constitution, it states that it needs to be done every 10 years. Well, in those days, doing a census, and of course the framers had no idea how this was going to work. It was just an idea. And it was the best idea they could all agree on. But when you think about, in this case, the federal marshals had to conduct it. They didn't want the states doing it because they wanted it to be conforming, the information, and it needed to all go to the president at the same time. So the best way was to have the federal marshals do it. Well, they wound up having 650 marshals. They weren't all marshals, they were people who were appointed by the marshals. They had 9 months to complete it. And, it was about 3.9 million people in the population at the time. That's a whole lot of work. Not only that, but Congress gave them nothing to work with. They gave them no forms. They told them the questions they wanted them to ask, but they gave them no forms. They gave them no paper, no utensils, nothing. And so I've read where in some cases there were scraps of paper where they would go to the household and write it down on a piece of paper. And then, of course, they eventually compiled it.
And of course, if you go to the microfilms of those early censuses and you see what a wide variety of things the marshals came up with in recording.
Yeah.
There's none that look the same from one state to the other.
Well, they were supposed to aggregate all the information and then post it for the population. And, if it was a county or a town, they would put it in a central place in the town where people could see it. And in theory, they were supposed to report any errors and stuff. And of course, that didn't go well with everybody, because you can imagine people are worried about privacy today for other reasons, but in those days, they came to America because they wanted all this independence, and so they didn't like necessarily having all of that information posted. They were to make 2 copies. One was to go there to be posted, and the other one was to go to the government, which would eventually then be reported to the president. Well, anytime you make more than 1 copy of something, back in the days when they didn't have whatever that tracing paper is that we used to use, I can't even remember
the carbon
now.
paper.
The carbon copy, yeah. That means that there was possibility of errors.
Well, and in some of the things that I haven't actually seen, but I've heard in lectures where, they would take and abbreviate things or eliminate things in some of the things, so you get 2 copies. If you're fortunate enough to get 2 copies of the same census for a place, there were differences in what you had to compare with.
I have a PowerPoint. I have a few exhibits, and the first one is just this. I got this right out of a government publication, so it's not copyrighted, but if you look at just starting on the top left and going down, it starts with the 1790 and then 1800 and then down to 1840. You can kind of see that in the days when they first started this, it was just the eastern seaboard pretty much. It was the 13 colonies plus a few other states. And then you begin to see a little bit of migration. And of course, this is one of the things that became a struggle with the House of Representatives, because as more territories were added, then there was a limit on how many people they would have in the House. And so they had to start, if it moved westward, well, then there were some of those would get the representatives and the East Coast would not. And so there were those kinds of things. They didn't want it to ever be political. But how could it not be? Because that was inevitable. So the president would get the summary, the final summary, at least at the beginning. Went to the president, and then, the Congress got a hold of this information and could at least use it to help support their positions at whatever that they were trying to do. The first questions were simply this: the name of each household, free white males of 16 and upwards. And that was to determine what the potential for military service
yeah.
and also perhaps industry at some point, because the Industrial Revolution had already started and it was on the mind of the framers. Free white males under 16, free white females, all other persons by sex and color, slaves, and at that point they really weren't they didn't enumerate the Northwest Territory. That came a little bit later.
So you have some basic questions, and like I said, with the tick marks and other resources, it still is possible. In fact, I need to pull one of those conference tapes out and listen to it again, because one of my lines, I have the family back to 1820 in Philadelphia, and I think I have them in 1810, but I need to re-listen to it so I make sure I do what I need to do to be accurate and make sure I do have the right family. So talk about accuracy. How accurate were the censuses?
Well, okay, so these, first of all, they go to the federal marshals and they say, "You're it." So these guys are, they've never done it before. And they need to go out and do this, and they appoint people who knows who those people were. And then they are supposed to visit every household in the whole United States. Well, first of all, you can imagine that not every household actually got visited. And in fact, there might have been some households that purposely weren't there when the guy came, because they didn't want to be part of that. So if you don't find your family, there's a good possibility that either they lived so far away, or it's possible that the neighbor, the federal marshal got tired and decided they'd go to the neighbor and see if they could find stuff. So there again, the accuracy sort of depends on what the neighbor knew. So if you were trying to look at one of these censuses, and can we put up just an example of one of them to show the tick marks? So there's the name of the household, and then that tells you how many people live in that household. Well, can you imagine? I mean, tick marks by itself are pretty hard to go back and do any sort of quality control on. So I'm going to say they were sort of accurate, but Congress was not always very happy with the outcome, too.
And you mentioned something with, and I know of a classic example. One of my mentors, people that I went to conference lectures, Marcia Huffman Rising, from out Missouri, she found a whole community that was not enumerated because they didn't have much to go across the rivers. And to do it by land would have meant traveling almost 100 miles upriver and back down. And so she did a whole thing. In fact, I think she ended up doing a book about tracing those families in that community because they were not anywhere to be found in the census.
Now, if we can put up the next slide, I want to show you that often well, that one is actually sort of the summary that would have been turned in. But let's go to the next one. And this one, now I told you that the enumerator would get all these pieces of paper and then they would make a copy. They would summarize it and then they would make a copy. Notice, you may not be able to see this, but what's interesting is that it's sort of in alphabetical
Alphabetical
order,
order.
which is a clue.
Yes.
That's not the way they did it originally. This was taken from the scraps of paper or the other things, and then it was put on this. So here's another opportunity for errors.
Mistakes.
And
You mean people didn't live in alphabetical order? Like they're buried in cemeteries in alphabetical order?
the other thing that's interesting is that the original summary was probably the one that was posted in the town, and the copy was the one that was actually sent to the federal government. And so that at the National Archives right now, it's very likely that if you're looking at something on microfilm, it was the copy of the original.
Which makes sense. If they're going to summarize or change anything and figure Congress isn't going to care, the people, if they can make corrections or take and object to something on there, they want them to see that. So
yeah. So the schedules are now confidential for 72 years, but back before 1850 they were not.
Yeah.
And so anybody could get that information, and there again, as I said before, that's a reason why some people probably didn't want to be included.
And there is, I don't know whether you've thought about this, but there is one very important point I always want to point out with the 1850 census. Although you get the members of the household, it doesn't tell you the relationship. And particularly beginners think, okay, there's the head of the household, there's a man, there's a woman, it's his wife. And more times than not, that is true. But there are other times when it is not. That woman is not, might be the wife has died and a sister-in-law is living in the household, helping with taking care of the children, or it may be someone else who is listed there. So it's not till 1880 that we can trust our assumption that that's the wife, or that that's all of the man's children, because I've got examples of where there are children from the wife's first marriage, and they're now married, and her children are listed there, and they're not there. I've seen cases where they've been given stepfather's name, and they really didn't have or weren't adopted to have stepfather's name.
So Congress has to approve every time they change the questions. Congress has to decide that. And that's kind of where in a way, that's kind of where the politics has come in. And actually in 1840, I read where they didn't have a Census Bureau in the beginning, but then they finally appointed this guy who said, they said, okay, you're in charge this decade. And he thought, well, okay, I'm responsible for this. So he developed questions, and he went ahead and started having them printed. And he sent that to Congress before they had even looked at it. And they said, whoa, wait a minute. You've overstepped your boundaries. We don't like these questions. And so they had to stop the printing presses and go back, and then they negotiated what they wanted. And of course, 1840s was kind of leading up to what eventually was the Civil War. And so they were beginning to be concerned about how do we count slaves, how do we enumerate slaves. The slave states wanted something and the free states didn't either. So the politics was getting involved in that quite a bit. But then by 1850s, and thereafter they established a census, someone that was permanent in charge of the Bureau.
Right.
And it was also then put under the Department of the Interior, I think it eventually got. So then in 1850, we finally get to see a census that has all kinds of really good questions. I mean, that's the beginning, and it evolves. If you can put up the slide of the 13th census, I think. Keep going. There we go. There we go. Well, you probably can't read this, but this is my all-time favorite one, I think, because of the amount of information that's on here. This is 1900, and then 1910 is good too. What's so great about this is that they ask questions like, how many children did a mother have, and how many are still living? Now, in researching a family, I didn't know for sure. I only knew about the people that I knew about.
Yeah.
But it was helpful for me to be able to reconcile. Wait a minute, there's really 9 children here and only 1 died. Who are these others? I need to go back in and find every one of those. And more than likely, those were pretty good numbers, because very often it was the woman who was actually giving that information.
That was on 1900 and 1910, and also was asked on some birth records for children, as women gave birth and their children's births were registered. And those 2 questions are the ones that I have said, if I could wave my magic wand, would appear on all censuses, because I have found children I didn't know about because of that.
Yeah.
Because of that. I would have never known to go looking for them.
Right.
If that hadn't been on the census.
The other things about that census is that it actually asks for the month and the year of birth. Which I don't think any of the other ones do.
No,
I think
that's
it's
the
just
only
that
one. And of course, it's helpful if they answer it correctly.
Well, yes, your example.
In a previous show, I had an example on that one.
But that's when you need to go to every census that you can find that they're in and see how consistent those answers are. But that month and year does give you something to go on that you can research.
Yeah, because playing with the ages, I found sometimes, it might be a year off, but I have had them off, looking at all of the censuses, as much as 7 years span from the first year when you subtract the age from the census and you get the year of birth. 7 years difference, and usually there's a couple of years in between. So you really have a problem with trying to track down which year do I look for. So that's why I always go to 1900 if they're living to see what that one says, and start with that because it gives me a month too. So.
And when they first developed this, it was either Jefferson or Franklin, I'm not sure which one now. They wanted to have a lot more information. They wanted, and it's just as well they didn't, because it took them actually 18 months to compile everything. So they would have, they didn't really have any way to do it except manually. But now, especially after 1850, they wanted to know where the country was going, and what was ahead, and what was the potential, the economic potential of the country. And so asking these kinds of questions was really interesting. The 1940, is it the 40? It's 1940 where they ask if there was a radio in the household.
Yes.
I've thought about that so much, and I think about, well, was that because they wanted to know if FDR fireside chats were getting out to the, how were they communicating with the public? And I have found nothing to tell me exactly, but...
I don't know how accurate this is, but what I heard was they were looking at, okay, what resources do we need to devote to the development of using a radio, radio stations.
To expand that?
Expand the communication, the availability, because certainly in the cities they had more utilities and resources that would make it fairly easy, but out in the prairie in the Midwest, what did they have out there?
Well,
did they have enough? Could they, even if they had a radio, could they hear a station, is what I've been told, and I don't know that's the gospel, but it makes sense.
I would just say that if you really want to use these, and you should, if you are doing any kind of research, first of all of the Federal Census, the population schedules are almost all online. And they're almost in all of the major databases. Now, later they added some supplemental schedules, and those are not necessarily available. It just depends on the year and the place. I would recommend this book by William Dollarhide, because it'll tell you all of it. It'll tell you what state has what and whether it was missing or whether it was lost. So that's really good. And then if you're interested in more of the political part of it, Margot Anderson has written The American Census, A Social History, and that's certainly worthwhile looking into as well. And it really gave a lot of background on the thought process that went into a lot of this. And, you know, we could spend a lot more time digging through every one of these schedules, because each one is unique. I'll just say this. I was looking at the 1950, I think it's the 50 schedule, where they ask if you had a bathroom. And there was still the possibility that people didn't.
I grew up in a neighborhood where until a lady died in the early 70s, and she had an outhouse right down the end of our street.
Well, I assume that in the next year or so, we're going to get access to that
April 1st, 2022.
Oh, all right. There you
is
go.
The official date.
And that will, you know, that way you can, if you were born prior to that, you can look yourself up and see what was enumerated. But anyway, it's a subject we could talk about forever, but I just found it interesting.
Yes. You want to mention Mount Vernon real quick?
I do, yes. Please join us, mvgenealogy.org. We are located in Alexandria, Virginia, and we welcome visitors. Go to the website to see our programs. We're doing everything by Zoom right now, but we would love to have you. So check it out.